So in the previous lesson, we took an introduction to the origins of the Cold War, and we explained some of the ideological and political background that existed immediately after the end of the Second World War, and we noted that the Cold War essentially was a period of history, specifically a period of history involving the United States and the Soviet Union, and a period of history that involved no direct confrontation between the two, but proxy wars that both of them engaged with, and a clear East-West rivalry that began to evolve. Now, we noted that this began to evolve sort of during and then immediately after the end of the Second World War. And this lesson is going to talk about the two major conferences that essentially shapes the post-war settlement, essentially shapes exactly what happens after the end of the Second World War. And we're going to begin in this lesson by talking about the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference is going to be the main focal point for this particular topic. It's going to involve talking about the main issues that was raised during the Yalta Conference, each of the main objectives from each of the main parties, as well as the outcomes of the conference, what was eventually decided, and then ultimately the impact of Yalta on the broader creation and establishment of the Cold War. So, beginning first then, as a basic introduction, the Yalta Conference was held between the 4th of February to the 11th of February 1945. And it was a pivotal meeting during which the leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, essentially came together to talk about the organization and the reorganization of post-war Europe and the final strategy to defeat Nazi Germany. So, by 1945, it was very clear that the Second World War was going to be won by the Allied powers. Okay, even as early as 1944, this was very clear, clearly going to take place, and so. Essentially, by February 1945, the allies of Great Britain and the US and Canada and a few other countries had been swiftly driving through France and liberating Paris, and were on their way to Berlin. Similarly, a similar thing was taking place in the East, and the Third Reich was in a state of collapse. Very quickly collapsing, and it would be only a couple of months before the Second World War in Europe comes to an end. So that's why Yalta, the conference itself, which was took place in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula, that's why the Yalta Conference was so important. Essentially, the main objectives was to discuss what was going to happen to Germany, what was going to happen to Eastern Europe, and what was going to happen to sort of a post-war world. In terms of what was going to happen to Germany, it was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers. The Allied powers, of course, being the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and then France as well. France would have been part of this too. This division of occupation would also be mirrored in Berlin. So not only was there a division of the entirety of Germany between these 4 zones of occupation, but those 4 zones of occupation would also be divided in Berlin. So even though Berlin is sort of in the east of Germany and would have been in the Soviet zone of occupation, the US, the UK, and France all had a presence in Berlin as well. In terms of Eastern Europe, the Allies agreed that there would be a reorganization of the Polish government. This reorganization would include both communists and non-communists, with the promise of there being free elections. We'll get to what eventually happens to Poland in a future lesson. In addition to this, Stalin was wanting acknowledgement of his influence over Eastern Europe. And at least at Yalta, it was seemingly implied that Stalin would effectively be allowed to have a certain degree of control over Eastern Europe, given that it was the Soviet Union that liberated the east of Europe from the Nazis. it was essentially under Stalin's remit that he would have a certain amount of influence and control. Now, the amount of influence and control that he would eventually gain over Eastern Europe was probably a lot more than the West considered to be acceptable. But at least at the time, it was implied that Stalin would have a certain degree of influence and control. In terms of a post-war world, there were three major aims that were essentially discussed at Yalta, among others, but these were the three main ones. The first was the establishment of a new international body, which would then promote peace and prevent any kind of future conflict. This, of course, becomes known as the United Nations. The leaders would agree upon the formation of the UN with provisions for the Security Council and the veto power that the Security Council would ultimately have. And to this very day, the Security Council has 5 permanent members, and those permanent members have a power to veto resolutions, which is very interesting. Now, the UN would ultimately come into existence with the San Francisco Conference, but we won't talk about that in any great detail here. That's something that you might want to look at when you do A-level. Potentially, maybe if you did A-level politics, you might get a chance to study a little bit of global politics and the UN, or even A-level history, looking at the Cold War in more detail. In addition to the United Nations, there is also the issue of war in the Pacific. The powers sought to secure Soviet participation in war against Japan. So essentially, as soon as the war in Europe was over, it would be the remit of the Soviet Union to turn their eyes to the Far East and start to attack the Japanese from that position as well. So Stalin essentially agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender, in exchange for some territorial concessions in the Far East. This included things like control over the Kuril Islands, as well as parts of Manchuria. And so, as this took place, within the sort of week of the Japan's downfall, you see 2 atomic bombs get dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, all of which culminating in the surrender of the Japanese eventually, but only with the Emperor Hirohito deciding to break the tie within the sort of Japanese high command to actually go about unconditional surrender. Finally, there was also the question of reparations. Who should pay for the war once it has ended? It was decided that the reparations would be taken primarily from Germany's economy. And so essentially, because Germany was completely and utterly in control of the reasoning behind the Second World War, it was completely Germany's fault that the Second World War began. It's not like the First World War, where there was a little bit more contention going on about various different empires all competing with each other, and it was sort of agreed upon by the victors that Germany would be the people that get the guilt for the war. With World War II, there was no doubt in anyone's mind who actually started it. It was the Third Reich. It was Nazi Germany. And so rather than requesting reparations that would be paid by Germany themselves, the reparations would just be taken from the German economy. Given that Germany would be occupied for a considerable amount of time after the end of the Second World War, this would be easy to achieve, easy to facilitate the taking of that revenue. So those were the sort of terms that were agreed upon at Yalta. What impact did this have on the Cold War itself? Because it's often seen that the Yalta Conference was something of a precursor to the start of the Cold War. The agreements in certain areas, particularly regarding things like Eastern Europe, began to lay the groundwork for the growing division that we would start to see between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. So we see, of course, that as Stalin essentially began to exert more and more influence and control over Eastern Europe, with the establishment of communist governments, this would start to clash with and contradict the basic ideals of the Western democracies. Equally, when it came to things like Poland, where there was promises of free elections, the Soviet Union established communist-dominated governments in Poland and other areas within Eastern Europe, essentially leading to decades and decades of Soviet influence. But in terms of Yalta itself, okay, it was seen that there was maybe hints at there being a growing division and a growing amount of tension between East and West at Yalta. It's really at Potsdam that we start to see the real groundworks and laying the foundations of the Cold War. The Potsdam Conference, of course, is what we'll talk about in the next lesson, and this takes place immediately after the end of the Second World War.